On September 12th, 2012, Apple announced the iPhone 5. It's the biggest thing to happen to iPhone since iPhone. And quite literally, this is the first iPhone to have a larger footprint since any of the other models. From the original iPhone all the way to the 4S, they've all had 3.5-inch displays, but this bumped it up to 4 inches. It does still have the same Retina resolution as the iPhone 4 and 4S, with 326 pixels per inch, but it also features an aluminum housing. It also has wonderfully chamfered mirrored edges, but this isn't the first iPhone to be made out of aluminum. The original iPhone was also an aluminum model, but it used plastic instead of the iPhone 5's glass for the antenna bands. The iPhone 5 was also the first iPhone, alongside the iPod Touch and newer iPads at the time, to come with the Lightning connector, which is a connector still being used to this day with the newest iPhones. Now, of course, from a carrier you could get it for a lower price, but the storage was also a big factor in how large it was, 64 gigabytes being the largest capacity at the time. And of course, it came with the classic iOS 6 and the last version of iOS to be skeuomorphic. The iPhone 5 was also the first iPhone to be able to use a nano SIM, which is something that is still being used today. However, because of its slight dependence on 3G, it will soon not be able to connect to a network, at least with AT&T. So because of this, I have this iPhone 6 Plus here on an older version of iOS to use as a actual phone, mainly just for cellular connectivity, and the iPhone 5 would be the actual daily used device. I also have a bunch of OtterBox Defender cases, but I decided to go against them because this commuter would keep the iPhone 5's slate housing in much better condition considering the age of some of these cases, and they might also damage it even though it's a case, so it would go against what it's being used for. The battery was also swapped with an iCloud locked one, and it's currently at 777 charges, so it's by no means brand new, but it still does hold a decent charge. So, with our iPhone 5 and 6 Plus, let's begin to use it for a week. On day 1 and 2, it wasn't all that spectacular. I mainly just signed into my services with mail, of course Apple ID, I signed into things like YouTube, and I basically just started to download apps. And of course you can see that with some apps, you won't be able to download the newest one. That's because the iPhone 5 is limited to iOS 10.3.4. So even though things like eBay could still work, it requires a newer version. Now you could get around this by jailbreaking. However, I'm trying to do this with a stock experience without jailbreaking nowadays. So because of this, it's a bit more difficult. If you were to jailbreak, you could download whatever you want. But with these limitations set in place, you're pretty limited to what you can do, because certain apps will outright not work, others may work, and things like YouTube are on borrowed time. Even though it does still work perfectly fine, I suspect that over time, the only way you'll be able to get it working if it does fail is with jailbreaking. Now things like Discord does still natively support it because it requires iOS 10 or newer, and it actually runs a bit better on the iPhone 5 compared to the 6. And, of course, you can still play classic and some newer games. With this, I started to play Plants vs. Zombies a bit more because it just feels better on a device like this. The form factor is pretty solid for even games like this, and even though it was released in 2012, this is still a pretty solid device. Of course, it is a smaller one and many people might prefer a larger device, but I honestly didn't think that this was a big deal. Day 3, it was essentially the same thing. I tried to download some more apps and games, and things like the Xbox and PlayStation apps, even though they let me install it because I was able to get an older version of it, it just doesn't work. So with the PlayStation app, sure, I can open it, but then it'll tell me to update it. So what's the point in that? Of course, you probably won't be able to get this fully functional even if you do jailbreak, because with the services themselves, the servers connecting to the app are probably just not functional anymore. And who remembers Workflow? Workflow was basically shortcuts before Apple made it shortcuts. It's interesting in that it's similar, but it's not. And of course with the camera, here we are doing a test on the photo and video performance. Now this is in a lower light environment, and it actually isn't that bad. Of course the stabilization isn't great, but what can you expect from a device this old? For today, nothing too much happened. I just played some more games, browsed a little bit on Reddit, and also YouTube, and I'm recording it on the 5, as you can see here. And overall, still pretty usable. I have used Safari as well to just do some basic web browsing, and apart from some websites not loading entirely correctly, it's still been working just fine, and the speed is actually very good for a device of its age. In comparison, the A5 chip in the iPhone 4S is noticeably slower compared to the A6 in the 5. So even with older iPhones becoming older like the 5, the chips in them will still be better than something like the A4 or the A5. So even when the 6S becomes obsolete with its A9 processor, it'll still probably be a pretty usable device considering how far it's gotten with software updates, and just how well the chip performs, even though it does tend to get a little toasty sometimes. Another thing that surprised me is the storage, or more specifically the lack of storage. Now this is on the latest iOS version it can run, so that means it takes up the most amount of space an operating system would on the phone. If it was iOS 6, we'd probably have even more storage free, but it's on iOS 10. And I have a lot of applications. You can see I have 31, and while not all of them are functional, they're still taking up space. For example, the Xbox and the PlayStation app, while those don't technically work anymore, I still left them on there just because why not? They also kind of look cool. But with that in mind, I still have 6.39 gigabytes free, and I did take a couple of photos and videos, and I still have free storage. Now granted, I'm not using it like an iPod. I have not synced any music over to it, which would definitely eat up the storage. But with only 16 gigabytes, I'm surprised how far I can actually go with it. Now 32 or 64 would definitely be preferable, but I guess I just don't need all that much storage. Now if it was actually for a dedicated photo or video type of camera device, like the iPhone 10, which I normally use, I need storage for that. That is 64 gigabytes, and it tends to fill up quick whenever I'm recording. But being a standard phone where I'm not actually recording all of the time, I'm not taking photos all too often, but I still am, I still have a decent amount of storage left. And of course, music would be for something like the iPod. But with that in mind, it's still surprisingly usable. However, 16 gigabytes is probably the lowest I could go, because 8 gigabytes, half of that is basically taken up by the system, and the other half, you could probably install like 10 to 20 apps at most without any photos or videos. It's day 6, and it's actually kind of hard to believe that I've already been using it for this long, because honestly, I've had a pretty decent experience with it. Of course, it can be a bit slow sometimes, and app support is very limiting because it's only going to get older, but apart from that, iOS 10 has aged very well on this device, and I would say that it's still pretty usable even nowadays. Of course, apart from app support, it's still a solid 32-bit device. Surprisingly, it has already been a week. But before we jump into the conclusion, let's recap day 7 real quick. Now, I don't have much footage for day 7, but to be honest, it wasn't that significant of a day anyways. I didn't really do much with the phone. I mainly just used Safari as needed, and of course I just used YouTube, played some games, occasionally checked Reddit, and apart from that, nothing too significant really happened. I didn't really take many photos, but the phone still does have storage remaining, which is always nice. Now, to be honest, if I took more photos, I'm sure it would definitely fill up faster, but with all the apps I installed, there is actually still storage left on it, which is always awesome to see, even including these apps which don't work anymore. So for example, iPhoto, which will just tell you that just use the Photos app, still takes up space. So I didn't really think I could get by with 16 gigabytes, but as long as you're not taking that many photos, then it works just fine. So now, let's jump into the conclusion and talk about the positives, the downsides, and just the overall experience of using an iPhone 5. The iPhone 5 has no Touch ID, a 4-inch Retina display, a Lightning port, which is also the first iPhone to have a Lightning connector, and a headphone jack. It also has a 8 megapixel camera sensor on the back and a 1.2 megapixel sensor on the front. Of course, it doesn't have Touch ID like the iPhone 5S and newer, but it still works as a home button. And while I was using the iPhone 5, I decided to not use a passcode, mainly just because it's more convenient to have it without it. If I had Touch ID, I would definitely have one, but in this case, I decided that the convenience was worth it more, even though it wasn't as secure. The form factor and the size of the iPhone 5 is also something that I really like. It has the classic volume up and down buttons, which are circular, instead of the typical longer rectangular ones. And the 4-inch display, while it may be small, it's a nice sized phone to hold, and even for watching videos, it's not too bad. It also does help out that it has a Retina display, and it looks really nice, and it really does hold up well, considering this is a 2012 smartphone. Now for software, this runs iOS 10. 10.3.4 is the latest version you can install on the iPhone 5. While it was released in 2016, there are still apps that are supported by it. Now for example, Discord requires iOS 10 or newer, so with that, you're fully up to date. But for other apps like YouTube or Reddit, you need a newer version of iOS to run the latest and greatest. But with that, you can still use the last compatible version of it. So for YouTube, even though it's an older version, even with Reddit, YouTube Studio, and other things like that, while they may be the oldest version that's compatible with iOS 10, they still work just fine. However, we come across issues that will only begin to increase over time. For example, these 3 apps here, Pokemon Go, the Xbox app, and the PlayStation app, all are not supported. Now, I tried to use them, I tried to log in, but with PlayStation, it would just immediately give me an update prompt, and you can't really bypass that unless you're jailbroken and you have some sort of tweak. But even then, I doubt it would work because they constantly change things like APIs and just connections to the server, so this older version of the app doesn't work. Now for the Xbox app, I thought it would work, but once I tried to log in, it just gave me an error message. And for Pokemon Go, it was similar with the PlayStation app, in which it just said, your phone's not compatible anymore. So with that, this issue is only going to increase over time, which is unfortunate, because the iPhone 5 is still a solid device to use. Now with that, there is always jailbreaking, considering this is stuck on iOS 10, and with Cydia and installing tweaks and things like that, it would definitely give it a lot more life and usability, considering you would probably be able to install apps that you couldn't before. For example, you could probably install the official eBay app, even though it technically wants a newer version, you might be able to find a way to get around it, because it complains that it's not running on iOS 13. Now for things like that, you might be able to install older versions of apps, which is always great. But of course, iOS 10 was released in 2016, and it's only getting older, so even though you do have Cydia, official app support is still going to drop over time. So, could you survive with the iPhone 5 for a week, or even longer? Well, if you need a device that does the bare minimum, can connect to the internet, download some apps and games, browse the web, send messages, listen to music, basic things like that, the iPhone 5 is more than capable for that. Now it is an older device, so you are limited with iOS 10. And app support is only going to decrease because it's not getting any newer. But This would also be a cool device to start jailbreaking with. But you are also able to downgrade this to iOS 8, and if you're lucky to have saved blobs, you might be able to get all the way down to iOS 6 as well, so you can always have the classic skeuomorphic design as well. But if you need an iPhone that needs to run the latest version of iOS and is a bit more powerful, then this would definitely not be able to fill the job anymore. Even though back when it was new, this was an awesome device to have. Even if you just needed this for the bare minimum and internet connectivity, there is still one issue that's inevitably going to affect all older iPhone models, and that is 3G and the eventual shutdown of it. Now, the entire reason I had to have this alongside with me is because of my carrier. I use AT&T, and they already started cutting off older iPhone models, and they made it so that the oldest model that is still compatible is the iPhone 6. Now, the iPhone 6 can completely use 4G without any reliance on 3G, but for the 5S and older, it still technically does use 3G somewhat, and because of that, they do not work anymore. And that's also why I had to have this to use as a hotspot, because I can't make calls on this, I can't connect to a network, because if I use my SIM card in here from the 6 Plus and put it into the iPhone 5, it's basically going to brick my SIM card, and then I'll have to contact AT&T, and it'll be a whole mess that is just easier to avoid by using a hotspot. But of course, that is just AT&T. There are other carriers that are still letting you use 3G up until it's eventually going to stop working. The towers are still going to be shut down, and there's nothing you really can do about that unless you somehow are made of money and you're able to bring back 3G just for older iPhone models. It's inevitably going to make all of these older iPhone models into better iPod touches. The iPhone 5 is still a really nice device, and if you're still using one, then it still holds up over all this time. But when it comes to the point where you won't be able to use the latest version of apps, or you can't even use your SIM card with it anymore, then it's definitely showing its age. At least it's still able to be used as a glorified iPod Touch, and even though you may not be able to use a SIM card with it, the internet is always going to be able to connect to it. Even in 2021 and going on into the future years, it would still definitely be a usable device just like the older models are. While they may be seen as obsolete, I'm still going to use this even after the challenge, and this is definitely going to be a nice usable device. Plus, where else are you going to find this amazing slate color? Even with this fashionable case here, the slate color still looks really awesome, and just seeing the small amount here is something that space gray, while it's really cool, it just has its own special charm that really can't be beat. And even though on camera it looks basically the same, you can really tell the difference in person. The only other issue I can think about the iPhone 5 is that these are older devices and batteries degrade over time. If you have an iPhone with a heavily used battery, then it drops very rapidly. However, this battery is at almost 800 charge cycles, and I was still able to get a full day's use out of it, and I only really had to charge it once or twice a day. Plus, if you do find a battery case for this, you're also able to extend the battery life. But if you do want to replace the battery, it's also a really easy device to get inside of. There's only 2 pentalobe screws at the bottom, and the screen lifts up. After you disconnect the battery, you're able to swap in a new one, and it's relatively easy compared to newer models. And just to mention it again, it did of course come in slate, but it also came in silver. And silver held up a lot better compared to slate because it chipped a lot easier because of how they anodized the aluminum. Silver is basically more of a raw aluminum type of color, so even though it can scuff easily, just like any aluminum device, it still holds up a lot better because at least it doesn't chip like the slate color does. And with that, we're at the end of the video. We took a deep dive into the iPhone 5, and overall, it's still a pretty solid device. With that, if you guys enjoyed the video, then be sure to stick around for more. Subscribe if you want to stay notified on any new videos that get posted, And, as always, thanks for watching.